There's a question that's haunted politics for 500 years. It sounds simple, almost too simple, but underneath it lies something most people refuse to confront. A truth about power that makes us uncomfortable. A truth about human nature that disturbs the idealist and the cynic alike. Is it better to be feared or loved? Niccolo Machiavelli asked this question in 1513. He wasn't the first to wonder, but he was the first to answer honestly, and his answer still terrifies people today. Not because it's cruel, not because it's evil, but because it's observational. Because it strips away the fantasy we cling to about how the world actually works. Machiavelli wasn't telling rulers what they should do in some perfect, imaginary kingdom. He was telling them what works in the world as it is, among people as they are. And people didn't like that then. They don't like it now. Machiavelli wrote, "The prince, in a moment of desperation, he'd been tortured, exiled, stripped of his position in Florence. Italy was fragmenting around him. Foreign armies marched through Italian cities like they owned them. Rulers rose and fell with terrifying speed. Alliances meant nothing. Treaties were paper. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. In that chaos, Machiavelli observed something. The princes who survived weren't the kindest. They weren't the most moral. They weren't the ones who believed in justice or divine right, or the goodness of their people. They were the ones who understood reality. And the reality he saw was this. Human beings are not naturally good. They're not naturally loyal. They're not naturally selfless. They're survivalists. They act in their own interest. And when circumstances change, when pressure mounts, when fear grips them, their loyalty evaporates. This is the foundation of everything Machiavelli believed. Not that people are evil, but that they're weak. Fickle, controlled by circumstance. And if you're a ruler, if you hold power, you cannot build your security on something as fragile as affection. So he asked the question, if you must choose, is it better to be feared or loved? His answer, feared, without question, without hesitation. But he didn't stop there. Because Machiavelli understood something most people miss when they reduce him to a cartoon villain. He understood that fear is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used precisely or it can be mishandled. It can create order or it can create rebellion. It can stabilize or it can destroy. The key is this: you can be feared without being hated. That distinction is everything. Love, Machiavelli argued, is given freely. It's a gift, and like any gift, it can be taken back. When times are good, people love their rulers. When the economy thrives, when there's peace, when life is comfortable, affection flows easily. But when crisis comes, when resources dry up, when sacrifice is required, love dissolves, because love is conditional. It depends on the beloved continuing to provide something: comfort, security, prosperity. The moment those things disappear, love turns to disappointment. Disappointment turns to resentment, and resentment turns to betrayal. Machiavelli saw this pattern repeat endlessly. Rulers who were beloved in peacetime, abandoned in war. Leaders who trusted in the goodness of their people, overthrown the moment things got difficult. Princes who believed loyalty was reciprocal, murdered by the same men who once swore oaths to them. Love is beautiful, but it's weak. It cannot survive pressure. It cannot endure hardship. It cannot hold a state together when everything is falling apart. Fear can. Fear doesn't depend on circumstances staying pleasant. Fear doesn't require constant validation. Fear doesn't need the ruler to make people happy. Fear is reliable. It's predictable. It operates on one simple principle: consequences. If people know that disobedience leads to punishment, they obey. If they know that betrayal leads to ruin, they remain loyal, not because they want to, but because the alternative is worse. This isn't cruelty for its own sake. This is calculation. This is understanding that human behavior responds to incentives, and the most powerful incentive is survival. Machiavelli looked at the princes who lasted, Cesare Borgia, Ferdinand of Aragon, the rulers who held their territories through impossible odds. And he saw a pattern. They weren't loved, they were respected, they were obeyed, they were feared. But, and this is critical, they were not hated. Hatred is what happens when fear becomes excessive, when cruelty becomes arbitrary, when punishment becomes entertainment, when a ruler takes more than necessary, when they violate what little dignity people have left. A feared ruler can maintain control indefinitely. A hated ruler is living on borrowed time. The difference is restraint. Machiavelli was not advocating for tyranny. He was advocating for realism. He was saying that if you're going to hold power, you need to understand what actually keeps you in power. And it's not speeches about virtue. It's not appeals to shared values. It's not hoping people will do the right thing. It's making sure people understand what happens if they don't. This is where Machiavelli parts ways with the entire moral tradition before him. The philosophers, the theologians, the idealists who wrote books about how rulers should behave, what virtues they should embody, how they should earn the love of their subjects through wisdom and justice. Machiavelli rejected all of it, not because virtue is bad, but because virtue is irrelevant if you're dead. And many virtuous princes ended up dead. He wasn't interested in how things should be. He was interested in how things are. And in the world as it actually exists, morality is a secondary concern. Survival is primary, power is primary, and power requires fear. People call Machiavelli cynical. Maybe he was. But maybe cynicism is just realism without the comforting lie. He looked at Renaissance Italy and saw the cost of idealism. He saw republics that believed in civic virtue, crushed by ruthless monarchs. He saw princes who tried to be just, overthrown by ambitious subordinates. He saw leaders who trusted in love, betrayed by the same crowds that once cheered for them. And he wrote it all down, not as a celebration, but as a warning. If you want to rule, you cannot rely on what people feel. Feelings change. You must rely on what people fear. Fear endures. But here's what most people don't realize when they read Machiavelli. When they reduce him to the ends justify the means, or might makes right, they miss the precision of his argument. They miss the careful balance he's describing. Because Machiavelli knew that fear alone isn't enough. Fear must be calculated, controlled, used sparingly, and only when necessary. The moment fear tips into hatred, the moment people have nothing left to lose, the entire structure collapses. A ruler who is feared can walk among his people. A ruler who is hated cannot leave his palace. And this is where part one must pause. Because we've established the foundation, we understand why Machiavelli asked the question. We understand his view of human nature. We understand why he chose fear over love. But we haven't confronted the real question yet, the question that will define part two. What happens when rulers misunderstand this? What happens when they confuse fear with terror, when they cross the line from stability into brutality? What happens when fear becomes hatred? That's where the collapse begins. So we return to where we started. The question that haunted Machiavelli, the question that still haunts us. Is it better to be feared or loved? You know the answer now. You know what Machiavelli saw in the wreckage of Renaissance Italy. You know why he chose fear, why he rejected the fantasies of philosophers and the promises of idealists. But knowing the answer doesn't make it easier to accept, because we want to believe love is enough. We want to believe that goodness wins, that justice prevails, that people respond to kindness with loyalty. We want the world to work the way we wish it worked. Machiavelli refuses us that comfort. He forces us to see what we'd rather ignore, that power operates by different rules, that survival requires calculation, that the leader who clings to virtue while his enemies embrace ruthlessness doesn't get remembered as noble. He just gets forgotten. This is why Machiavelli disturbs us. Not because he's wrong, but because he might be right. 500 years later, we're still arguing with him. still trying to prove that love can be as strong as fear, that morality isn't a weakness, that idealism isn't suicide. And maybe we're right to argue. Maybe the world has changed. Maybe humanity has evolved past the brutal calculus of Renaissance politics. Or maybe we're just telling ourselves another comforting lie. Because when you look at power today, real power, not the performance of it, you still see Machiavelli's fingerprints everywhere. You still see leaders who understand that fear works when love fails. You still see the same pattern repeating. The princes who survive aren't the kindest. They're the ones who understand reality. If this made you think differently about power, subscribe. There's more uncomfortable truth ahead. Because reality doesn't care what we wish it was. It only cares what it is.